else been engaged in ESG initiatives?
So ASM, which is the company I work for, is a Dutch company. We've been subject to, for some time, to elevated expectations when it comes to operating in the EU. We've been, especially since we've been listed on the Amsterdam Stock Exchange. But really, our ESG efforts ramped up when our prior CEO, Benjamin Lowe, joined the company in 2020. Right in the middle of the pandemic. And he saw the criticality of making a strategic priority. So if you look at ASM's strategy, sustainability is one of the key pillars of our strategy. In 2021, we really hit the ground running with a first major initiative, and that was our commitment to the net zero carbon emissions by 2035 goal. But we've also been actively engaged in things like the Responsible Business Alliance and others for a number of years as well, which kind of hit on more of the human aspects of ESG.
What do you feel your company has accomplished, and what would you still like to accomplish? And this is a fairly new area for your company.
So I joined ASM in September of 2022. So I've been here just shy of 2 years. I previously worked for one of our major customers in the semiconductor industry. So I'm still kind of trying to figure out what those accomplishments need to be. I'm their first official director of supply chain sustainability. That's my role here. And we've been engaged with suppliers in the past, but the focus has been pretty limited, kind of superficial, and really just to meet some regulatory requirements. But we've really set some ambitious goals, partly in support of the net zero emissions goals, but even within our own human rights and supplier engagement objectives. We're getting a lot more involved, and we're building resources to do that. So for me personally, it's really about working to increase the quality and the scope of our engagements with our suppliers, working to mature their capabilities over time. And if we can get to a place where we can meet that carbon emissions goal by 2035, then I will definitely feel accomplished. But certainly, if we get to a place where we feel like we have a strong supply chain who understands and values ESG, then I'll also feel accomplished in that space.
Okay, great. So what's been your greatest ESG related challenge so far in the past 2 years?
There's a lot. I think anyone who knows ESG knows there is a really broad range of potential things that you could take on, challenges that you will face. I think for me, there's a couple that kind of stand out. One is there are a lot of competing priorities that may slow our pace of change. So sometimes I feel this sense of urgency that we need to do things for the planet or for people that need to happen quickly. But some of the competing challenges, particularly as it relates to compliance and reporting, make it difficult to prioritize some of the work that we want to do in the other spaces. That's not to say that those things aren't supportive of each other, but it just does, sort of impact our resources, right, and our ability to do some of these things. So I think that the sort of being able to identify those right priorities is probably the biggest thing. And then obviously that also means that the pace of change is not necessarily where I'd like for it to be. So that second piece is, okay, how can I move faster? How can I get our suppliers to move faster in this space? When they also have challenges with competing priorities and things that they're trying to accomplish. So I think that sort of being able to fit within the business context and find those priorities that you want to drive and being able to fit that within the resources that you have is a constant challenge. Overcoming it, TBD. I think, still working on it. I think it comes back to just really being focused on what you want to accomplish. And sometimes it means maybe not getting everything done that you want to, but as long as you're getting, the big things that you want to get done, then that's a big step. But I'm still working on the overcoming, I think.
That is fair. Wow. So tell me, I want to dive a little bit more into the supply chain piece. Um, and obviously they're suppliers, so you only have so much input. And so, and you mentioned, that you have competing priorities, they have competing priorities. So when you're working with your suppliers, how do you go about balancing all of that?
Yeah. I think it starts with a very clear alignment at an executive level, that the company has said this is a priority for them, and taking action to support that, both in terms of resources, but also in the way that we message and engage with our suppliers about what our priorities are. Um, you know, I think where it becomes a little more challenging is when you get beyond the executive level, you kind of get to that mid-level management team who's got to get the day-to-day done. And, they've got pressure in the supply chain context, for finding the right price for a product or making sure it gets where it needs to get on time when it needs to get there, or it meets certain quality or technology standards. It's tough to find that space to make sure that we're also talking about sustainability. But having an executive leadership team that's supportive of what you're trying to accomplish enables and makes room for those conversations, right? So the expectation, just as a simple example, last week I was at a semiconductor conference called Semicon West, and we were meeting with suppliers, and I had a seat at the table, and the team made sure I was there to talk about critical sustainability priorities that we have as a company. And they're getting that message not just from me, but the other people at the table from our organization, right? So it's a lot about alignment of expectations and alignment of goals. That said, I am also pragmatic, and I know that sometimes there's challenges in finding that space to have these conversations or to do those things or to get the suppliers to prioritize those things. So I do everything I can to remove any of the sort of check the box exercises, things where maybe it's just an overhead activity. Maybe somebody's asking us to fill out a survey, or we're asking them to fill out a survey that doesn't necessarily lead to an action. So I try to make sure that we're really being pragmatic in our approach, but also that we are clear on why we're asking for these things and doing everything we can to simplify the ask that we have. So if we're asking for data, we're working with our peers in the industry to see if we can figure out, if we're asking for the same information, can we do it in a way that's consistent and that maybe enables you to answer the questions once and share that information with multiple customers. So looking for ways to try to create that efficiency in the process, but also I've been exploring some enabling around things like uh, uh, finding funding or support that they can use to invest in sustainability initiatives. Still early in the learning phase around that, but finding things that we can do to enable and support them to move forward as well. So really trying to find things that remove those barriers for the suppliers to really be able to drive forward.
Okay, super. Um, let's see. How do you measure your progress towards your short and long-term goals?
Yeah, it's a good question, and one we're being challenged to really be able to articulate as part of our um, reporting requirements. So if as an EU-based company, we do have new obligations under something called the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the EU CSRD. And as part of that, you're supposed to talk about what are your goals, what are your KPIs, how do you measure success as part of this. I think it's easy to measure the environmental elements, I think, more than the S and maybe the G. Um, the environmental stuff, we can collect data from suppliers, we can see their progress over time. We can identify if they have, just using the climate topic, right? If they have climate initiatives, do they have climate goals? And we can turn around and report that kind of information externally. And we certainly have our own environmental goals that we report on as part of that as well as a company. Where it gets harder is in the S, right? So how do you know if you're successful in helping people, for example, be more safe in their facilities at a supplier site, right? Like, is the facility that they're working in safe, and can they operate on a day-to-day basis safely? That's a little harder to measure, but we do try to use programs like the Responsible Business Alliance. They have a code of conduct assessment process. So we use that to try to at least get a baseline on, okay, do you have policies and procedures associated with safety? Have you had any incidents? Are they investigated when there is an incident? So we're looking for those management systems to make sure that the facilities are safe. And then we periodically need to go look and see if they're safe. And then we report that out in the terms of KPIs in our annual report. So, have we done self-assessments with our suppliers? Do they understand what the RBA code of conduct is and what they need to do to make sure workers are safe, as an example?
I guess, do you have insight into how the customers are responding?
Yeah, so part of our initiative, and part of the reason why we drive some of these things, is our customer expectations, right? So our customers are, for example, members of the Responsible Business Alliance, so they expect us to abide by the Responsible Business Alliance, which means we in turn expect our suppliers to do that. They don't necessarily look for specific indicators on things like the social elements, right? Are you treating people with, under human rights construct in the right way? What they're looking for is, do we have those management systems similar to what I just described, right? What they're looking for is, do we have the management systems in place to ensure that those things are not happening? So they're looking at, are we assessing our suppliers? Are we auditing our suppliers? Are we engaging with them on environmental initiatives? They do have their own aggressive net zero carbon emissions goals, for example. And so they expect us to help support those objectives as well. As an example, ASM is participating in something called the Semiconductor Climate Consortium. And currently our VP of EHS and sustainability is the chair of that forum. And that forum includes many of our customers as well as many of our peer companies. And part of that forum is to try to figure out, okay, how do we work together as an industry to drive improvement? And so they're looking for us to engage with our suppliers to drive that improvement as well. So we're trying to support that critical stakeholder in the customer, but we also have similar requests and expectations from our investors and other stakeholder groups who are asking for an understanding of what we're doing to address our supply chain and how we're managing those risks.
Okay. So you're relatively new to your role. But just in the last 2 years, if you had to start all over again, is there anything you would have done differently?
I would have read up on the EU a little more, before I came to work for a European-based company. No, I'm still joking aside. I think it's actually really, really interesting to see where the different perspectives from a geographic standpoint, from a country perspective, on what are the priorities and what are the things we should be focusing on and how we should be tackling these issues. Something I would not have had exposure to in my prior role at my prior employer. In terms of what I might do differently, I think some of it is about educating our supply base. So I kind of started into this with some assumptions about suppliers understanding our expectations. And it turns out they maybe weren't as clear on what our expectations were as I had thought they would be when I started. So a lot of probably going back and having to explain, okay, this is what our expectation is. This is why it's important. This is why you need to do this. You need to figure out how to support it. So I think that would be one thing I would think about differently. The other is we have a fair number of, because we're not a huge company, we do have a fair number of smaller suppliers. And those smaller suppliers really need a different sort of approach than maybe what we would do in a more standardized way for larger companies who are used to this kind of stuff. So I think if I had an opportunity, I would go back and think about how that strategy might be different for smaller suppliers. And I'm still trying to figure out how to make those adjustments as we go. But it would have been good to have that understanding earlier in the process.
What concrete steps do you think that a business wanting to incorporate ESG can take to create a tangible, practical plan that achieves real impact?
Oh, that's a good question. I think one of the things, as I've been having some conversations with some of the smaller suppliers who are trying to kind of wrap their arms um, around this ESG topic, is starting first with understanding what your stakeholders care about. So if you're going to launch into a plan or launch into something, it's good to first understand obviously your own company values and priorities. So that's obviously a first critical step. But the second is what are the expectations of your stakeholders? So your customers, your shareholders, if you're a public company, your nonprofits or community groups that you engage with or where you operate would be critical. And I think that helps you sort of define what should the priorities really be. And then it's picking, maybe the first couple that you really need to prioritize, right? And it may be that you have to start with compliance because that's ultimately, you want to make sure you're legal in where you operate and what you do. But if you want to think about going beyond legal, what does that look like? And so, again, going back to that feedback of what are the things that the stakeholders value and what should you maybe prioritize as a company to really to drive. But I would say try not to do everything. As I've said before, prioritization. I think there's a term like radical prioritization, right? Radical something, but radical prioritization is the way I would describe it. Like making sure that you're really clear on what your priorities are, because there are so many things that you can do within the ESG context. It can be overwhelming, and so you've really got to be very clear on sort of what are the most important things. And then I think something that's highly underestimated is making sure that you have a plan for resourcing to support that objective, both in the near term in terms of achieving that objective, but also sustaining it, right? So I think a lot of times people will go, oh, we got to the goal, and then they'll just stop. And it's like, okay, but then what are you going to do to make sure that impact is sustained? Or is that something where you need to back away from it because it isn't as relevant to your business after that point? That's fine too, but you need to have that clear plan. So resourcing, both from a tools and systems perspective, but also a people perspective, is really important. So it's good to have a goal, you need to think about it, but you also need to have a plan for how you're going to support that objective. And to assume that people are going to somehow be able to absorb it within their day-to-day is probably not realistic, because this isn't something that's been incorporated in business in the past. That's not to say over time people won't eventually start to build in these ESG elements, thinking about sustainability in their planning or thinking about sustainability in their product development. Those things will happen, but they will happen over time. And if you're just getting started, make sure you have the resources to really drive it.
Great advice. Actually, I think that's fantastic advice. So with that, thank you.